In this video, I'm going to be guiding you on the only paragraph structure you need for IB Economics, Paper 1, 2, and 3. I'm sure you've seen many models before, like the Peel model, and this is what I call the idea model. So I is for the identification of the point. So this is when you identify an economic theory, which you will be explaining later on in the paragraph. D is for data, meaning the real-world examples or the quotes from the case study from Paper 2 and Paper 3. This is the data that you are bringing in, adding value to your text. You can also reference an appropriate diagram that you've drawn, which further adds value and enhances your explanation. E is for explanation. This is when you're applying your chains of logical reasoning of the appropriate economic theories that will in turn directly answer the question. Please be reminded that there is no set way of writing a paragraph. So you can have all the data and diagrams first and then the explanation, or you can have the explanation first and then the data and diagrams, or you can just merge them all together, which is perfectly fine. And assess is where you stop talking about the diagram and explanations and you link what you've said back to the question. And using this model, you'll be able to answer any question for Paper 1, 2, and 3. Before I show you some real student examples, here's some key information. In order to write an effective paragraph, subject knowledge is absolutely key. You need to be able to identify the key point, such as an appropriate stakeholder, and then to develop that point using economic theory and chains of logical reasoning. The sample paragraphs that I'm going to provide are from students that scored a range of 14, 13, and 12 marks. The quality of these individual paragraphs did not dictate their grade, as essays are graded on their overall quality. So as you will see later, some paragraphs will differ in length and detail. And remember that this model is just a suggested model and it is a tool to help you develop consistent paragraphs throughout the entire question. Moving on to student examples. Evaluate the use of supply-side policies to reduce unemployment. Deregulation is a market-based supply-side policy focusing in increasing competition. As you can see, the first bit up here is the identification of point. In this case, is deregulation. In the 1980s, the CAB regulated air flight routes, meaning only one airline could fly between certain destinations. This authority was demolished, leading to an increase in competition as more airlines entered the market. The student has used the example of CAB and its flight routes, and they have explained how it could increase competition. Here they have used a real-world example and also explained it. The next paragraph further elaborates on this. The increase in the competition led to a reduction in price. Furthermore, because more airlines entered the market, this led to an increase in the demand for labor. As shown on the wage labor diagram, more workers are demanded Q1 to Q2 and they receive higher wages, W1 to W2. As you can see in this paragraph, there's a real-world example and a reference to a diagram. Here. So right now we have the identification of the economic theory, we have the diagrams and examples which are explained, and the last paragraph has assessed this in relation to the question. The logical steps above prove that deregulation successfully achieves a reduction in unemployment. As you can clearly see that this paragraph has an identification of the knowledge point, data and diagram, explanation, and has assessed them in relation to the question. Here's another example. Discuss the view that market-based supply-side policies are the most effective way for a government to achieve economic growth. And this was this student's approach. Market-based supply-side policies can lead to inequitable outcomes, creating a conflict in macroeconomic objectives. This is clearly the knowledge point, which is inequitable outcomes. The UK government reduced corporate and personal income tax. This is demonstrated by the shift in the Lorenz curve in the UK from L1 to L2, moving further away from the line of perfect equality. This paragraph here has some real-world examples and a diagram reference. As a result of reducing taxes, the system is made less progressive. Higher income earners now pay a lower marginal tax, leading them to keep more of their income. This directly serves the increase in income disparity within the UK. As you can see that these two parts here have evidence of the explanation of the economic theory, which is linked to the diagram and real-world examples. And lastly, let's see if the student has assessed the impact in relation to the question. This has led to an increase in the Gini coefficient in the UK, showing the harmful impact in economic equality, which comes at the expense of achieving economic growth. And that is a resounding yes. This next example is about oligopolistic markets and price discrimination. Explain the conditions necessary for firms in oligopolistic markets to engage in price discrimination. As you can see here, the first section of this paragraph is the identification of the economic theory, which is firms leveraging PED to maximize profits. The second part is the reference to the real-world example and data, which is Cathay Pacific, and how they increased their prices by 50% on holidays such as Christmas. The third section here is good utilization of chains of logical reasoning of the economic theory whilst using the same example. And the final section assesses the impact of PED in relation to the question. Not only that the idea model works for the analysis of stakeholders and other economic theory, it is good for evaluation too. Let me show you. This is a question on supply-side policies and reducing unemployment, and this student has chosen that supply-side policy might not work in the recessionary gap, which is the first part of this paragraph. The second part is linking it to the diagram. The Keynesian curve in Figure 2 shows that the aggregate demand in the economy is at stage 1. This is then followed by a clear explanation using economic theory and chains of logical reasoning. And finally, for the last part, they have assessed the impact of the economy being in stage 1 and how it does not reduce unemployment. Let's show you another example. Evaluate the extent to which a depreciating exchange rate may benefit or harm an economy. In this paragraph here, the identification is that the inability to meet the Marshall-Lerner condition, and then we have a clear example of Japan, which has experienced a persistent currency account deficit and is taking on more loans to boost its economy. Then the student here uses the appropriate economic theory and chains of logical reasoning to explain this point, and then they assess the impact of not meeting the Marshall-Lerner condition in relation to the question. And for my final example, this candidate has identified that the factors that affect price elasticity of demand can contradict each other. Then they have said that governments may choose to completely ignore PED data and then provides an example, followed by an explanation which uses economic terminology and chains of logical reasoning appropriately. And lastly, the student has assessed the impact of PED and has recommended a holistic approach using PES and YED. Now I'm going to show you a real script that got 10 out of 10 using the idea model. If you want to know how to structure the longer questions in paper 1, 2, and 3, check out my playlist in the description below. Explain how interventionist supply-side policies have both demand-side and supply-side effects on an economy. In the first paragraph, I have decided to blank this out in grey as this is the definition of interventionist supply-side policy, and this is not the goal of this video. For this question, this candidate decided to use 2 paragraphs, one for the demand-side effects and the other for the supply-side effects. You can see here that the candidate has identified the appropriate economic theory, which is one supply-side effect on an economy is long-term productive capacity. The next section of this paragraph explains the impact of this point using an example and diagram. And then the third section of this paragraph makes excellent use of the economic theory, terminology, and chains of reasoning. And then they have assessed the impact of interventionist supply-side policy in relation to the question. So you can see that the first part of this question has followed the idea model. The second part of this question is the demand-side effects of supply-side policies, which is government spending and investment. This is the identification of the economic theory. And they have repeated the use of data, diagram, and explanation to finish off the question. And again, they have assessed the impact of interventionist supply-side policy have a demand-side effect on the economy, which is linked directly back to the question. And at the end of the answer, this candidate provided a summary of their response. I hope that helped. I hope you guys have a good day. Bye bye.